This is Earthfiles, the award-winning news site with the latest updates in science, environment, and real X-Files. Podcasting in-depth reports beyond the 6 o'clock news by Emmy Award-winning journalist Linda Moulton Howe.
Sasquatch, Bigfoot, names long associated with tall, hairy creatures that seem half man and half ape. To begin this Earthfiles podcast, I have an actual 1978 recording near Snohomish, Washington, of an 8-foot-tall Sasquatch, according to the eyewitness. The homeowner had been hearing eerie, high-pitched sounds for several days, and her dog was agitated. This particular late afternoon, she said she could see a tall, hairy, ape-like creature in the woods and ran in the house for her tape recorder. She said she stood on her back porch with the recorder as the Sasquatch began its high-pitched scream. Here now is an excerpt of that audio tape. At the end of 2006, eyewitnesses in the United States and Malaysia reported seeing tall, hairy, Bigfoot-type creatures. The most dramatic incident was in Washington County, Wisconsin, on November 9th at 1 a.m. There in the woods near a place called Holy Hill, a man reported to the sheriff's department that a 7-foot-tall, dark-haired animal larger than a bear jumped into the back of the man's pickup, dragged out a deer carcass, and took off running. Sheriff's deputies never found the dead deer or the Bigfoot. A week later, not far from Holy Hill, but in the neighboring county of Waukesha, 2 boys reported seeing a Bigfoot at the edge of the woods where they were playing on a trampoline. The creature was about 100 yards away. The boys said it was, quote, a hairy monster on the corner of the woods leaning on a tree, unquote. At the same time, on the other side of the world in the deep jungles of Malaysia, at least 10 people in half a dozen regions described a Bigfoot creature and its footprints in the jungle. The distance between some of the tracks was nearly 6 feet. The footprints were pressed into the ground at least 3 inches, suggesting great weight. Ironically, while these Bigfoot dramas were being reported, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho, was being ridiculed for his investigations of Bigfoot Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest. Jeff Meldrum, Ph.D., received his Master's of Science degree from Utah's Brigham Young University in 1984 after studying vertebrate locomotion. 5 years later, in 1989, he received his Ph.D. in Anatomical Sciences from the State University of New York in Stony Brook. His Ph.D. research focused upon terrestrial adaptations in the foot skeletons of African monkeys, with implications for hominid bipedalism. After that, he did postdoctoral work at Duke University for 2.5 years. Then he worked as professor of evolutionary morphology in the Cell, Molecular, and Structural Biological Department at the medical school campus of Northwestern University in Chicago. By 1993, Jeff Meldrum became professor of human anatomy at Idaho State University. In November 2006, Professor Meldrum had participated in a Discovery Channel television program about Bigfoot Sasquatch, and his new book entitled Sasquatch Legend Meets Science was released in September. Professor Meldrum also has more than 200 plaster casts of alleged Bigfoot Sasquatch footprints, some of which he has gathered himself from field investigations. But the spotlight on his work provoked criticism from some fellow faculty members and a local Associated Press reporter, who took the angle that Bigfoot Sasquatch sightings are hoaxes. The criticisms reached the internet, where one false story even had Professor Meldrum stripped of his tenure and fired for politically unacceptable research. Recently, I talked with Professor Meldrum about the unjustified attacks against him in the context of his distinguished academic career and his near conviction that there is an unidentified species out there.
The fact that you take the whole Sasquatch seriously, I would think that everybody else should take it seriously.
Well, one might think that. I have colleagues who say, well, I'm a believer, therefore I'm no longer objective, which is not the case. I've always rejected the label of believer and its misapplication. Belief typically, for most people, carries the connotation of a position of faith. That is, one accepts a tenet or a conviction in the absence of conclusive proof. And I have certainly not done that. I mean, I don't know for a certainty whether Sasquatch exists or not by the standards of scientific methodology.
Meaning that you don't have the body.
That's right. But the charge that science doesn't begin until there's a body is absolutely baseless. It would be unscientific to ignore the evidence that is available and to just simply wait, sitting on one's hands for a body to be provided or to drop into one's lap. My position is there is ample suggestive circumstantial evidence, even physical evidence in the form of hair that defies identification. That situation in and of itself should be perplexing to most rational people. If there are strands of hair, which are uncontestably hair, not some artificial fiber, and yet no professional hair identifier, hair analyst, can attribute them to a known animal, common or uncommon, is in itself a perplexing situation that is worthy of our consideration.
Well, that leads to your new book and how the book came about and what you think is the strongest evidence so far that you've presented in that book.
I became involved in this when I was confronted with a set of footprints. I mean, that's what really pulled me in. A very clear set of very fresh tracks, 35, 45 in number, along a muddy farming access road in the foothills of the Blue Mountains outside of Walla, Washington. And there was no room for misidentification. This was either or. It was either a hoax or it was the trace of a living animal.
Mm-hmm.
And given my background, I was impressed to the point where I felt compelled to pursue the question a bit further.
Now, what was the date, the time you were there, where exactly in relationship to Walla Walla?
It's about a 20-minute drive to the east of the northeastern corner of Walla Walla, up into the foothills, a place called 5 Points. It occurred in 1996.
How long were each of those prints, and what was the distance between each one?
Right. Well, where they were just sort of strolling along the dirt road, something apparently had spooked it because it spun, made a hairpin turn, and began walking a little more briskly. And these footprints were just under 15 inches in length. And I could easily match the step, which was only, about 3 feet, 36 inches maybe. But then when it apparently was spooked, presumably by a car coming down this gravel road, late on a Saturday night, early Sunday morning, it literally made a spinning turn, started walking back, glancing back over its shoulder as indicated by the right foot angling out at 45 degrees every couple of steps. And then it took off, literally began running up on the front half of its feet. Its heels were not making contact. The stride nearly doubled in length. It was leaving full-length imprints, very deep, 2.5 inches in the soft-tilled soil, the very moist tilled soil.
Now, what is a typical large man's foot length?
Typical is probably between 10 and 11 inches. Size 10.5 is probably one of the most common sizes for U.S. males. When you get up to 13 inches, 13.5 inches, you're up to about 1 to 2% of the male population.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, a 14-inch to 15-inch foot, you're talking about probably 0.5% of 1% or 0.1% of 1% of the population. So it's an exceptionally large footprint.
Can you talk about why this footprint is not human?
Yes, and this is what really grabbed my attention, was several of the tracks were these half tracks where the heel was in the air, but not in the way that you or I would run down the beach and leave a small imprint with just the ball of our foot and the 5 toes. This imprint comprised the entire front half of the foot, in front of what I would infer would be the position of what's called the transverse tarsal joint or mid-tarsal joint, which in humans is quite stable. It screws into a locked position that helps to support the arch along the length of the foot, which is a very characteristic feature of the human foot. These feet were very flat and then exhibited this sign of midfoot flexibility, which is an ape characteristic. The mid-tarsal break, or the ability to flex the foot at that midpoint, is an adaptation particularly present in apes that use a grasp climbing adaptation in their locomotion. That is, they have this big, robust, big toe that diverges out and opposes the lateral 4 remaining digits in a pincher grip as it climbs up inclined supports like a tree trunk or a branch. And in order to maintain that grasp, the midfoot flexibility allows the levering action of the hind part of the foot, the heel segment, to flex relative to the front prehensile portion of the foot. And it's that interesting combination of features that is present in the Sasquatch foot that really caught my attention. It had a big toe that was no longer divergent, like in the chimpanzee or gorilla, but yet it seemed to retain that midfoot flexibility, and the toes were still noticeably long. That was the key, because in order for the toes to remain long, they have to be spared the bending forces that we impose on our feet, on our toes in particular, when we push off. All that taken together is really an elegant adaptation for the habitat in which these animals supposedly are in, which is very broken, rough terrain with lots of steep inclines. This allows them to navigate through that quite efficiently, much more so than we can, even with stiff boots on. These were clearly not made by a simple set of carved feet strapped to someone's boots, tromping in the mud, opportunistically taking advantage of the softer soil. They couldn't have been, in my estimation. If you were using static, stiff feet, it would have required at least 3 sets of varied footprints with variation in toe position carved into the tracks, and an additional set to be used in those instances where just the front half of the foot left an imprint, because a stiff, straight foot could not be used to make these half tracks. The presence of the half tracks, the presence of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge that was evident in this particular set of tracks, spurred me on to look for other examples. And so I began to identify other situations where half tracks were identified. And the proportions were similar, the context was similar. There were other examples of mid-tarsal pressure ridges, which occur when the foot makes full contact with the ground, but then as the step proceeds and the heel is elevated, now the pressure is concentrated over the forepart of the foot disproportionately now, because half of the foot is bearing the entire body weight. It will sometimes create a pressure ridge, which is a release of pressure where material is extruded out behind the foot. And as I looked for other examples of this, more and more of them popped up, again with similar configuration, similar placement and proportion. And as those examples continued to accumulate, it just became more and more unlikely in my mind that these were just a series of spurious hoaxes.
Now, when it comes to eyewitness reports of encounters with these big Sasquatch, Bigfoot creatures, what one that you know about has the most detail and the most substance?
The one that has always impressed me is the experience of Julie Davis.
What date was that?
That was at least 2 or 3 years ago. Julie's very experienced in the outdoors, has hiked solo the Continental Divide Trail through much of Colorado, and she's an avid goat packer. And she was out with a couple of her goats and a couple dogs in a very remote area of southern Colorado in the Waimanooch Mountains, and had gone off trail to get a little more secluded. Even in that remote area, she still was bumping into other hikers on the trail on occasion and just wanted some seclusion. So went several miles off trail to a very nice little meadow with a lake and had set up camp. On arriving, her dogs had acted up, and she thought that this is bear country and thought that there might be a bear kind of stalking around the meadow. The dogs were acting up a little more. She didn't want the dogs to get tangled with the bear, so she'd taken them and stuck them in the tent and grabbed her pepper spray And as she stepped out, she noticed the goats were very attentive to something behind her tent. She stepped out of the tent, stood up, turned around, and was there face to face, less than 10 feet away, with a 8-foot Sasquatch standing in broad daylight right behind her tent. And she locked eyes with this individual, and it stared at her, and then it glanced at her goats, and then looked back at her, and then looked at the goats. But she had a very good look at its face and was able to describe the details of its facial features. There was just a sense of, I won't bother you if you won't bother me. And at that point it turned and strode off towards the tree line, and she remarked at its grace and fluidity of its gait, given its bulk and size. And it glanced back at her at one point and disappeared in the woods. One of the things that stuck in my mind, probably the most, because it was an odd observation, I thought, was that she noted that there was short hair across the bridge of its nose. The hair came quite up high on its cheeks and was continuous right across the bridge of its nose. That struck me as a bit odd if you have in mind the vision of a chimpanzee or gorilla, neither of which have that feature. Mm-hmm. But I reached up to my bookshelf and I pulled down a book which has some very sharp portraits of adult male orangutans. And sure enough, they have hair, very short hair, but it extends right across the bridge of their nose.
What about these eyewitness accounts that they have seen a Sasquatch standing in front of them and the eyes were red?
Right. One of the early encounters I had with a witness, Daryl Olin in Northern California, laid claim to having a videotape of one in which the individual was under a ledge or something, reclining, and as they approached, its eyes glowed red, as if they were self-illuminating. I spoke with the fellow at the video lab that enhanced and highlighted and provided stills of the image, and basically he said he couldn't see any of the things that Daryl was pointing out. There was no eye shine that he could see or anything. So, I'm always a bit skeptical of that, other than if this animal has proportionately large eyes in order to gather light and for nocturnal behaviors, a widely dilated pupil would produce a red eye effect, just as you get with the flash of a photograph of an individual with very pale blue eyes or with dilated eyes under dim light conditions. But the notion of self-illuminating, glowing red eyes doesn't sit well with me at this point, because I don't have any good data to confirm those suggestions.
Why is it, you think, there have been so many eyewitness reports of these tall creatures really all over the world? Why do you think we don't have a body or a skeleton?
Right. Well, it still is perplexing that that someone hasn't stumbled on something, but yet we're making discoveries all the time. In paleontology, the new species are found. In cryptozoology, new species are found. If this is a large-bodied omnivorous primate, it probably has no natural predators. It's at the top of its food chain. If it's a large ape, it has probably a very long life expectancy, 40 to 60 years perhaps. It reproduces infrequently, presumably, again, if we can extrapolate from a great ape, so that births are rare and infrequent and widely spaced. An adult female orangutan may only give birth to 4 individuals in her entire lifetime, anywhere from 4 to 8 years between births. So, given a very rare population with long life expectancy, with infrequent reproduction, and no natural predators, when a death occurs, 1, it's a very rare event, and 2, it's going to be a natural event. And therefore, animals that die natural deaths usually, as they become old, decrepit, ill, they secrete themselves off into some nook or cranny or thicket or whatever. And once they pass away, insects, other decomposers and whatnot, have their way with the remains, and then the skeletons are carried off by scavengers, by porcupines, by rodents. People don't often realize a porcupine can gnaw down a very large bone to nothing. I've found elk bones which have been chewed by porcupines, and there's just not much left, even to identify which particular bone it is. They're just chewed down to almost nothing. Anyway, the second factor then is the environment, the physical environment. Where these animals are most reported are wet coniferous forests. In the Pacific Northwest, these are soils that are largely volcanic-derived soils that are notoriously acidic. And acidic soils and acidic conditions are not conducive to the preservation of bone. So that very shortly, there's not much left. If you stop and think that every year, literally thousands of deer die of winter kill from predators and just from succumbing to the rigors of winter. And yet, when you go out for a hike in the springtime, you don't find the floor of the forest littered with deer carcasses. They're very efficiently recycled.
What about the idea that there might be some sort of subterranean tunnels running in this country for reasons unknown, but that these Sasquatch Bigfoot might literally have a subterranean life?
It's an interesting proposition, but one that is based on meager or non-existent evidence. I mean, yes, there are lava tubes and caves and so forth in the Cascade Mountains, but no one has ever documented or demonstrated the existence of any extensive network that could be utilized for travel or for habitation by an unknown population. I don't think that anyone needs to resort to that type of a scenario in order to explain the elusiveness of this animal. I think that their rarity, their behavior, if you talk to any person who has experience with wildlife photography, with trapping of exotic animals or whatnot, invariably they will tell you that the most difficult animals to deal with, to locate, to photograph, to capture, are animals that are rare, that are solitary, that are far-ranging, and that are nocturnal. Coincidentally, all of those aspects apply to the Sasquatch, plus we have an animal which has an intelligence which is at least on par with that of a great ape, if not more so.
Now, I'm talking to you on December 19th, and you're sitting in your office at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho, right?
Right.
What is this story that was circulated on the web that you had lost your professorship at the university because of your Bigfoot Sasquatch research?
Right. Well, what happened was, when we were anticipating the release of the book, which was only to be that a serious professor writes a book about a topic that is not often taken so seriously, and yet treats it in a very scientific fashion and has the endorsements of the likes of Jane Goodall and George Schaller. But unfortunately, the reporter they sent out felt there was a different story to be told, and he barked up a different tree, and he found a couple of skeptics on campus who have in the past said negative things about my research and my preoccupation with the subject. And he created a controversy and, quite frankly, misrepresented some of the things. My tenure has never been questioned or placed in jeopardy, nor have I sat and thought aloud to the reporter how long I might remain at ISU. It never was said or happened.
But your tenureship at Idaho State University is in place, is intact, and is not threatened?
Absolutely.
So the good news is that Professor Meldrum is supported by Idaho State University, and he intends to keep investigating and reporting about the mysterious Sasquatch. In a review of Professor Jeff Meldrum's new book, Dr. George Schaller, Vice President of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Science and Exploration Program, wrote this, quote, "Jeff Meldrum is a scientist, an expert in human locomotor adaptations. In Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, he examines all evidence critically, not to force a conclusion, but to establish a baseline of facts upon which further research can depend. His science is not submerged by opinion and dogmatic assumption. With objectivity and insight, he analyzes evidence from tracks, skin ridges on the soles of feet, film footage, and DNA, and he compares it to that on primates and various other species. He disentangles fact from anecdote, supposition and wishful thinking, and concludes that the search for Yeti and Sasquatch is a valid scientific endeavor. By offering a critical scrutiny, his book, Sasquatch, does more for this field of investigation than all the past arguments and polemics of contesting experts." Unquote.
Thanks for listening to this Earthfiles podcast, from the edges of science, environment, and real X-Files. Go to www.earthfiles.com to see more than 1,000 Earthfiles reports with photographs, drawings, and documents. And visit Earthfiles every day, every week, for new reports and new podcasts. That's www.earthfiles.com.